The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. On this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Special Problems in the Study of Sufi Ideas by Idries Shah. Theories about Sufism. Let us presume no background of Sufi ideas on the part of an imaginary student who has recently heard of Sufism. He has three possible choices of source material. The first would be reference books and works written by people who have made this subject their especial province. The second might be organizations purporting to teach or practice Sufism or using its terminology. The third could be individuals and perhaps groups of people, not always in Middle Eastern countries, who are reputedly Sufis. He may not yet have been induced to believe that Sufism is to be labeled Mohammedan mysticism or the cult of the dervishes. What does this man learn, and what are his problems? One of the first things that he could discover is that the very word Sufism is a new one, a German coinage of 1821. No Sufi ignorant of Western languages would be likely to recognize it on sight. Instead of Sufism, our student would have to deal with terms such as the Idries, named after the founder of a certain rule, who died in 1166. Or he might come across references to the people of truth, the masters, or perhaps the near ones. Another possibility is the Arabic phrase mutasawwif, he who strives to be a Sufi. There are organizations called the Builders, the Blameworthy, which, in constitution and sometimes even minor symbolism, closely resemble Western cults and societies like Freemasonry. These names can ring oddly and not always felicitously in the contemporary Western ear. This fact alone is a real, though not obvious, psychological problem. As there is no standard appellation for Sufism, the inquirer may turn to the word Sufi itself and determine that it suddenly became current about 1,000 years ago, according to the 15th century poet and Sufi master Jami in his Nafahat el-Uns. Sheikh Surawadi dates it to the 9th century, and the word is not sufficiently established to be found in dictionaries of such a comparatively early date. Imam Qushayri, in his Rasail, places the appearance of the word in about 822. Earlier Sufis used many names, including the kindred, the recluses, the virtuous, the near ones. It became current both in the Near East and in Western Europe, for example in Ibn Masara of Córdoba, Spain, 883 to 931. And it is still in general use to describe particularly the best product of certain ideas and practices, by no means confined to what people would conventionally call religious. He will find plenty of definitions for the word, but his problem is now reversed. Instead of coming up against a mere label of no great age, he gets so many descriptions of Sufi that he might as well have none at all. According to some authors, and they are in the majority, Sufi is traceable to the Arabic word pronounced suf, which literally means wool, referring to the material from which the simple robes of the early Muslim mystics were made. Externalists in the East and West have often adopted this etymology, which therefore often appears in reference books as the derivation. These, it is further claimed, were made of wool in imitation of the dress of Christian anchorites who once abounded in the Syrian and Egyptian deserts and elsewhere in the Near and Middle East. Externalists in the East and West have often adopted this etymology, suf equals wool, which therefore often appears in reference books as the derivation. But this definition, plausible though it may appear, will not solve our problem as to name, let alone ideas, in Sufism. Equally important lexicographers stress that wool is the garb of animals. As-suf libas al-inam, Arabic quotation from Hujwiri's Revelation of the Veiled. And emphasize that the Sufi objective is towards the perfectioning or completing of the human mind, not to emulate a herd, and that the Sufis, always highly conscious of symbolism, would never adopt such a name. Furthermore, there is the awkward fact that, according to tradition, the companions of the bench, the Ashab as-Safa, are said in tradition to have been the Sufis of the time of Muhammad, who died in 632, and that they formed themselves into an esoteric group in the year 623, and that their name is a derivation from this phrase. This and other derivations have been used by Sufis themselves, explaining that bench is not the original word, but the nearest equivalence which the companions could find to their own word for themselves. Although some grammarians have pointed out that the wool origin is etymologically more likely and more probable than, say, the derivation from piety, safwa, or even saf, contracted from the phrase first rank of the worthy, others have contested such opinions on the ground that nicknames do not have to abide by the rules of orthography. Now, the name is important as an introduction to the ideas, as we shall see in a moment. Meanwhile, let us look at its associations. Sufis claim that a certain kind of mental and other activity can produce, under special conditions and with particular efforts, what is termed a higher working of the mind, leading to special perceptions whose apparatus is latent in the ordinary man. Sufism is therefore the transcending of ordinary limitations. Note: higher functions of the mind, for example, the Persian couplet Ba Mushid Beshudi Insan Be Mushid Mandi Haywan, with a guide you may become a real man, without one you will remain an animal, and Rumi, from realm to realm man went, reaching his present reasoning, knowledgeable, robust state, forgetting earlier forms of intelligence. So too shall he pass beyond the current forms of perception. There are 1,000 other forms of mind. And the degree of necessity determines the development of organs in man, therefore increase your necessity. Not surprisingly, in consequence, the word Sufi has been linked by some with the Greek word for divine wisdom, Sophia, and also with the Hebrew Kabbalistic term Ein Sof, the absolutely infinite. It would not reduce the problems of the student at this stage to learn that it is said, with all the authority of the Jewish encyclopedia, that Hebrew experts regard the Kabbalah and the Hasidim, the Jewish mystics, as originating with Sufism or a tradition identical with it. Neither would it encourage him to hear that, although the Sufis themselves claim their knowledge to have existed for thousands of years, they deny that it is derivative, affirming that it is an equivalence of the Hermetic, Pythagorean, and Platonic streams. Our still uninitiated student may by now be thoroughly confused, but he has had a glimpse of the problems of studying Sufi ideas, even if only because he can witness for himself the unproductive struggle of scholastics. A possible refuge would be found if our man could accept the affirmation of a specialist, Professor Nicholson, or if he asked a Sufi. Now Nicholson says, some European scholars identified it with sophos in the sense of theosophist. But Noldeke showed conclusively that the name was derived from suf, wool, and was originally applied to those Muslim ascetics who, in imitation of Christian hermits, clad themselves in coarse woolen garb as a sign of penitence and renunciation of worldly vanities. This characteristic, if not venturesome opinion was published in 1914. 4 years earlier, Nicholson himself had offered his translation of the 11th century Revelation, the earliest available Persian treatment of Sufism, and one of the most authoritative Sufi texts. In its pages, the author, the Venerable Hujwiri, specifically states, doggedly translated but ignored by the professor, that Sufi has no etymology. Nicholson shows no curiosity about this claim, but thinking about it could have led him to an important idea in Sufism. For him, quite clearly, a word must have an etymology. Unconsciously assuming that no etymology must be absurd, he looks no further in that direction, but, all undismayed, continues to seek an etymological derivation. Like Nöldeke and many others, such a mind will prefer the word wool to the seeming paradox of no etymology. This is surely the reason why, in his recent book on Sufism, the learned Dominican Father Cyprian Rice, an admirer and pupil of Nicholson, says, half a century after the English publication of Hujwiri's text, a version which he praises, "From the habit of wearing coarse garments of wool, Suf, they became known as Sufis." But acquaintanceship with Sufis, let alone almost any degree of access to their practices and oral traditions, could easily have resolved any seeming contradiction between the existence of a word and its having no ready etymological derivation. The answer is that the Sufis regard the sounds expressed in writing by the letters S-U-F, in Arabic the signs for Soad, Waw, Fa, as significant, in this same order of use, in their effect upon human mentation. The Sufis are, therefore, the people of Suf. Having disposed of that conundrum, and incidentally illustrating the difficulties of getting to grips with Sufi ideas when one thinks only along certain lines, we immediately see a fresh and characteristic problem arising to replace it. The contemporary thinker is likely to be interested in this explanation, this idea that sound influences the brain, only within the limitations imposed by himself. He may accept it as a theoretical possibility insofar as it is expressed to him in terms which are regarded as admissible at the time of communication. This is summed up by the Sufi ancient Abdulaziz Mekki, died 652, as, "Offer a donkey a salad, and he will ask you what kind of thistle it is." If we say sounds have an effect upon man, making it possible, other things being equal, for him to have experiences beyond the normal, he may persuasively insist that this is mere occultism, primitive nonsense of the order of Om Mani Padme Hum, abracadabra, and the rest. But taking into account not objectivity but simply the current phase of accepted thought, we can instead say to him, the human brain, as you are doubtless aware, may be likened to an electronic computer. It responds to impacts or vibrations of sight, sound, touch, and so on in certain predetermined or programmed ways. It is held by some that the sounds roughly represented by the signs S-U-F are among those for reaction to which the brain is or may be programmed. He may very well now be able to assimilate this wretched simplification into his existing pattern of thinking. This condition existing in our vis-a-vis, the special problem here is that many of those who are anxious to study Sufi ideas are in fact unwilling, because of a systematic intellectual commitment, to allow certain contentions about Sufism held by Sufis to be retained in the mind. This situation, whose existence is demonstrated by much personal experience, is far more widespread than this single example might suggest. The problem is not made easier by the common tendency of the individual addressed to attempt to deal with Sufi ideas by outright rejection. A typical answer goes something like this: To think in the terms suggested by you would wreck my established ways of thought. This individual is quite mistaken in believing this. To the Sufi, he is really a man undervaluing his own capacities. Another reaction is to try to rationalize or reinterpret the ideas being offered him in the terms of some system, anthropological, sociological, sophistical, psychological, which he himself finds more to his taste. In our example, this subjective condition would perhaps be expressed in the statement, "Ah, yes, this theory of the influence of sound has obviously been produced in order to give a more esoteric twist to the rather mundane fact, wool." But this kind of thinking will not ultimately succeed because, far from being represented only among primitive tribes or buried in books in dead languages, Sufi ideas are in varying degrees contained in the background and studies of up to 40 million people alive today, those connected with Sufism. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation and is copyright 2019. All rights reserved.